unpacking something that is profoundly confusing, yet incredibly pervasive. We're going to talk about the persistent emotional loneliness carried by adults who had, by all accounts, seemingly normal upbringings. I mean, we're talking about folks who grew up in homes where meals were on the table, birthdays were celebrated with the whole shebang, and school supplies were always bought. Yet, they carry this ache that feels almost impossible to justify. There's no dramatic trauma, no visible rupture to point a finger at. So, where does all this disorientation actually come from? Well, there's a phrase that really hits the nail on the head. Some wounds are made of what never happened at all. It's a pretty stark, defining reality because when we think of a wound, we're naturally conditioned to look for bruises, right? We look for clear scenes of conflict, or we want easy language to describe an attack. But what happens when the pain comes purely from an omission? Just a lack. A child's inner life is simply treated as inconvenient or completely irrelevant. They aren't attacked, they just aren't met. It's literally a wound built entirely out of an absence. Okay, let's dive into this. Clinical psychologist Dr. Jonice Webb uses an absolutely brilliant analogy to explain this. She calls this type of emotional neglect the white space in the family picture, rather than the picture itself. Because you see, emotional neglect isn't usually found in the obvious content of a childhood memory. No, it's found in the negative space, the spaces where a caregiver's response should have been. The child cried and no one came emotionally close. The child tried to explain a feeling and they were corrected instead of understood. And over time, that child learns a very quiet, very dangerous lesson. My inner world just does not matter here. Section 1. When feelings become errors. To figure out how this invisibility actually takes root, we have to rewind back to childhood. And remember, it doesn't usually happen through dramatic cruelty. It happens through ordinary, everyday dismissals that systematically train a developing child to treat their very own feelings as mistakes. It starts with phrases exactly like, "It's not a big deal." We've all heard it, right? Adults say this all the time. And often they genuinely believe they're helping by shrinking the size of the kid's problem, just trying to calm them down. But what they're inadvertently doing is completely denying the child's lived reality. And then it gets compounded. You hear, "You're too sensitive," or "Stop overreacting," or "There's literally nothing to be upset about." Imagine the suffocating, cumulative effect of hearing this relentlessly while your brain is still developing. The message the child receives isn't just that their feeling is inconvenient. The deeper, much more damaging takeaway is that the feeling is fundamentally inaccurate. And finally, the classic, "You're fine." Psychologist Nicole LePera points out an incredible insight about this relentless contradiction. When an environment repeatedly denies a child's reality, it creates a deep split inside the developing self. The child's body is producing very real emotional signals, but the people they depend on for their literal survival are insisting those signals are wrong. So what happens? The nervous system adapts. The child slowly turns away from their own internal knowing. They start looking outward, scanning other people's faces and judgments for confirmation, and they permanently begin to distrust their own intuition. Self-doubt literally becomes a protective mechanism. Crazy, right? Section 2. The missing mirror. Identity isn't just something we build in a vacuum. It's formed through relationship. Psychotherapist Jasmin Lee Cori writes beautifully about the quiet miracle of attunement. When a child is consistently not seen, they don't just feel invisible, they actually begin to doubt if they are fully real. Think about the stark dissonance here. A caregiver might be entirely focused on the external reality, praising the straight A's, managing the soccer schedules, correcting behavior. They might be physically sitting right there at the dinner table. But their internal reality, the kid's exhaustion, their sadness, or their fear, goes completely unmet. The caregiver sees the achievement, but they entirely miss the person. So how does a kid even begin to make sense of this massive emotional gap? Well, consider the logic of shame. Psychologist Lindsay Gibson explains that a child simply cannot comprehend that a parent might be emotionally immature, or depressed, or just overwhelmed. Kids don't think like that. Instead, they interpret this invisible emotional absence as undeniable proof of their own personal defect. They think, if I were just easier to love, they'd see me. If I were more interesting, if I were better, smarter, or prettier, maybe I would matter. The absence of connection gets internalized as a deep-seated, painful feeling of inadequacy. Invisibility becomes shame. Section 3. Performing the self. So how does that invisible kid actually survive into adulthood? They survive by becoming the highly competent, overachieving, charming, or endlessly pleasing adult. This brings us to a truly fascinating clinical concept, the as-if personality. It's a performed self, organized entirely around whatever the environment seems able to recognize, reward, or tolerate. It's ironically what makes so many people incredibly successful at work, but completely exhausted in life. If your sadness gets ignored, but your perfect grades get attention, will you become the successful achiever? If your vulnerability creates discomfort, but your helpfulness gets praise, you become the perpetual caretaker. Creating a version of selfhood designed to be noticed is an adaptation. It is a survival strategy, not a weakness.
But here's the real tragedy. When that strategy actually works, the difference between "I like what you do" and "I see who you are." External validation ultimately fails to heal the core wound. Why? Because the applause, the big promotions, the compliments, they all attach purely to the performance. The adapted self gets all the attention, leaving the authentic, deeper self completely unseen, entirely untouched, and frankly, just as lonely as it was in childhood. Which leaves the high-functioning adult asking this incredibly heavy question: do I exist if no one notices me? Just take a second and let that breathe. This is the absolute emotional pivot of our explainer today. It perfectly summarizes that chronic, sometimes compulsive adult search for validation. You aren't vain. You aren't shallow or just attention-seeking. You are simply searching for the mirror that was missing when you were young. Your nervous system is just trying to stabilize a self that was never fully reflected back to you.
Section 4. Learning to trust again. So how do you step out of this lifelong performance? Healing emotional invisibility isn't about just vaguely deciding to, validate yourself. That phrase wildly underestimates the depth of your adaptation. Healing requires a difficult, deliberate reversal. Step 1. Pause before dismissing a feeling. When discomfort pops up, you have to actively stop that automatic reflex to minimize it or say, "Oh, I'm just being dramatic." Step 2. Acknowledge the hurt or preference. Before you twist your needs around someone else to keep the peace, simply notice what you actually want. Step 3. Bear witness to your inner world. You literally have to step into the role your early environment failed to play. Your nervous system must gradually, repeatedly relearn that feelings are not defects. They're not absolute truth for sure, but they aren't worthless noise either. They are incredibly useful data from your body and mind trying to organize your experience, and they can absolutely be integrated.
Because the truth is, the child inside who is never seen doesn't need to be turned into a performance anymore. That child needs to be met. And perhaps the deepest repair of all begins when you can finally look at your own history and say, with quiet certainty, what I felt mattered, even when no one knew how to see it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helps you bear witness to your own internal reality. I'm going to leave you with this one final thought. If you finally stop performing today, who might you actually have the space to become? Until next time, keep learning and keep looking inward.
Thank you for watching. If something in this resonated with you, then you're already closer than you think. If you're ready to go deeper, there's a link below to my book, The Survival Self: How Childhood Adaptation Becomes Adult Identity, and How to Finally Live Beyond It. This isn't theory, it's a framework you can actually use. Tap the link below and step into it.